Dan Walters is probably the most important newsman in California, or probably in the country.
Oh God, don't do that.
Hey, I'm not going to do that because I'll tell you what, Dan, the truth.
Probably neither is true.
No, actually, you know, anyone that's put as much, what is it, 40 years in the business?
44 years in September.
Yeah, and I think at the last, 20 at the Sacramento Bee?
Yeah, just about
syndicated columnists throughout on the word of politics for the last 20 years for the Sacramento Bee, and you're syndicated in how many other papers?
About 50.
About 50. You reach about 10 million people a day.
I've never counted them, so I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. We're going to start this off by saying we're just honored to have you here with us on the Cutting Edge because, you know, a lot of great things have happened in California here in the last couple of years, and you've been right on that cutting edge of finding out and understanding what was going on. So at any rate, what we'd like to do today is start off with probably the most important thing that's happened to our state, and that's the recall recently, a historic recall, and how that, and you've written several things about the recall and about what the ramifications have been, but can you kind of encapsulate it and say how historic it really was and what's really happened?
Well, it's obviously historic to have a recall of almost anybody. It very, very seldom happens. Certainly it never happened in California before for a statewide official, much less a governor. It's only happened once ever in the United States that a governor has been recalled, and that was almost a century ago. So that was historic in all those respects. And then to have arguably the most famous movie star in the world run for governor in the recall and win kind of adds that extra several layers to the thing that make it truly historic.
One of the things is how effective is Arnold after he's been elected? And I think he's less than 180 days into this part of his term. How do you think he's doing?
Yeah, he's, well, actually quite a bit less than 80 days, more like about 4 months or something like that.
Since the election, what was it, October 2nd?
Since he actually took over, it's only been about 4 months. So
right.
It seems like he's been governor forever, doesn't it? In a way. Well, he's very engaged, has an agenda, very engaged, going down the agenda item by item, trying to move the legislature by cajoling them, by threatening them, by schmoozing with them, by smoking cigars with them, by any way he can get around there, trying to get the legislature, which is difficult because it's a very liberal legislature, Democratic legislature, very liberal legislature. So it's very difficult for any Republican governor to move a legislature like that on an agenda. One of
the things he wants to do is on the workman's compensation, and you've written quite a bit about that. What's the corrective action for workman's compensation? I know it's a difficult situation.
Oh, it's very complicated. Probably the most complicated thing there is in state government, to tell you the truth. It's a huge thing. It's $20+ billion a year. It involves tremendous amounts of money. Everybody who has a piece of that action, injured workers, lawyers, doctors, chiropractors, rehab people, hospitals, everybody, insurance companies, all are trying to protect their piece of the pie, and nobody wants to give up any piece of the pie. And they all employ lots of lobbyists because there's so much money at stake, and they're willing to spend a lot of money to protect their piece of the pie. And so moving workers' comp is through every governor that I've dealt with has tried to change workers' comp and reform it. And although it has been changed from time to time, I don't think it's been probably reformed truly.
One of the things that Tom McClintock wanted to do is he said we should go to, during the election cycle, he said we should go to an Arizona or a Nevada type of workman's compensation. Do you know the differences between the two? And
I know some of the differences, and I know why, some of the cost factors. For example, a job-related injury in California is 10 to 20 times more likely to use a procedure than the National Academy of Occupational Medicine suggests is good. Whether it's surgery or X-rays, and everything, which tends to run up the bills, obviously.
Sure.
And if an injured worker has surgery, even unneeded surgery, obviously he's going to be out of work longer and recuperating. So it's those are some of the things that run up the bill in California. It's a very litigious system. It's relatively easy to get classified as having a permanent disability in California. That's one of the areas that's under attack in this latest reform effort. That runs up the bill. About 89% of the benefits go to workers with partial disabilities, mostly permanent partial disabilities.
If you will, tie that into the, if it's possible, would you tie that into the $15 billion that we just, Proposition 57 and 58, we just approved in the state of California? How does any of that, all that debt that we owe, tie in with workman's compensation?
Well, the debt we owe is much bigger than $15 billion. The debt we owe is already something north of $40 billion, if truth be known, and probably it will be 60 billion or so before we ever get out of this hole. That's another story. A little bit of it has to do with workers' comp, because local governments and state government also have workers' compensation costs that they have to pay. It's not a big part of that, but it's a contributing factor to the overall budget problem that the state and local governments have in California.
One of the things that's most important about local governments and things here that you've touched on in many of your articles is the pension issue with all the public employees, with firemen and police, and these tremendous pension spikes that have gone on from the state, and that's affecting probably all across the country. So how does that play into this whole debt crisis concept?
That's a bigger factor than workers' compensation. Public pensions in California have gotten relatively fat, particularly those for so-called safety workers, policemen, firemen mostly, but there are a lot of people you wouldn't consider to be safety people are under that system. 3% per year after 30 years means you can retire at 90% pay in your early 50s. Those benefits were extended over the last few years, mostly because the public employees retirement system had the same kind of hubris that the legislature did in enacting the budget. Just as the legislature and the governor assumed that the big cornucopia of money from the stock market would go on forever, so that the pension systems assumed that the big cornucopia from the stock market would go on forever, and they could afford to raise these pensions without any cost to the taxpayers. Well, that turned out to be just as false. So at the same time we have to deal with the budget crisis born of the first error, we also have to have it exacerbated by the second error, the pension error. The state, for example, has about a $2 billion bump in retirement costs that it can't afford to pay. It's borrowing money. It's trying to borrow money. They tried to do it under Gray Davis, and they tried to do it under Schwarzenegger, to borrow money to pay the state's pension costs because it can't afford to do so in other respects. And local governments, very many of them are borrowing to pay their pension costs, and they've seen their pension bills escalate in the same way that other employers have seen their workers' compensation bills escalate.
Dan, let me jump in for a minute, and I thank you so much for joining us this morning. Congratulations on your 20th anniversary of being with the Sacramento Bee.
Well, I'm not quite there yet. It'll be a few more months.
It's 84 to this time. Back in '92, you did a second edition of a book, actually it was done the first time in 1986, called The New California, Facing the 21st Century. And I want to quote you something from that book. There's some evidence that California's crushing social and economic problems are sinking in both the state's civil leadership and the larger population. Can you give us an update as to how you perceive what's happening in the state?
Well, all the things that I said were happening in that book have come true. They happened more quickly than I thought they would. So if anything, I was a little conservative. But all the social and economic and cultural trends that were evident in the mid-'80s and also in the early '90s have come to pass in California. And I think that what happens in California is unique. First of all, we are the most complex, diverse society ever in the history of humankind. And I don't mean just ethnically. I mean, it's beyond ethnicity. It's culture, it's lifestyle, it's a whole bunch of things. And it's very difficult to find kind of what you might call civic or social consensus within that diversity. And the American system of government is essentially a negative system. In other words, it's designed to make it difficult to enact laws. You have to go through committees and two houses, executive signature and court tests, unlike, say, the parliamentary system where it's relatively easy to make policy. It's difficult in America, and purposely so. The Founding Fathers were suspicious of power, and they wanted to make it difficult to make law. But the system works fairly well when you have a kind of an overall consensus of social values. So it probably still works pretty well in Iowa or Idaho or Minnesota or someplace like that. It's finding difficulty in California because in the lack of the social consensus on where we ought to be doing, say building highways, for example. Do we want to build highways? We don't know whether we want to build highways or not in California. We kind of do, we kind of don't, but there's no clear direction. Therefore, politicians who actually react only when they see some sort of larger consensus on something tend to kind of stall out. They don't make policy in any of these areas, whether it's transportation or water or anything, because They don't know where the public's going. The public doesn't know where it's going. And so we just kind of drift along. And that's kind of the, I guess you might say the unanticipated cost of diversity is difficulty in making public policy, just reaching consensus and implementing that consensus on anything.
Is that the reason, Dan, why we haven't gotten a real immigration policy for California, where a real will from the people to stop illegal immigrants coming into this country?
We are clearly ambivalent about it in California, but of course it's also not a state issue to be resolved. It has to be resolved at the federal level. That's really not such a good example. A better example might be water or transportation, something that's really under the state purview. We can't agree on those issues either, and so politics tends to be a reactive business, and when it doesn't, politicians don't see a clear consensus on something, they tend to kind of stall out, and that gives rise, on the other hand, to the flurry of initiatives. People get frustrated at inaction on various things, and you see then a flurry of initiatives trying to move policy outside the legislative process, or you see another manifestation of that, and that's kind of what you might call ad hoc local action. I'm not sure about Orange County, but I think it's true that Orange County has a local tax override, a sales tax to probably finance roads and highways.
Proposition M, yeah.
Urban County and the state has. That's a response, first started in Santa Clara County back in the mid-'80s in Silicon Valley. That's a response to the chronic inaction at the state level on transportation. Local communities who have to put up with the effects of traffic congestion say, we're tired of dealing with this stuff. We're going to take matters in our own hands. We'll build the highways. If the state's not going to do them, we'll tax ourselves. Now, sales tax is a poor way to finance transportation. It should be done by fuel taxes, basically. But if it's the only avenue left open to local governments, they'll do it. And that's, again, a reaction to the frustration with the state level, just as the initiative process and the use of the initiative process is a reaction to inaction at the state level.
Let's shoot at this coming election in November. It's going to be about, I don't know, as you said, about 15 or 20 initiatives. Who knows?
We don't know how many, a dozen maybe, something like that.
It's going to be,
but there'll be big ones.
It will be, yeah. We're not talking about small ideas here. We're talking about a lot of ideas, and along with that, we're going to have a national election, and we're going to have a lot of other local elections involved. How much I'm trying to think, for the people out there that want to know, how much was the recall and the new governor and all of that kind of wave of change to the state of California, how do you think that's going to affect the voting habits of the people coming in for the next election?
Well, it's a little too early to say. Clearly, Arnold Schwarzenegger is using the ballot or the threat of ballot measures to try to push his agenda. It's very evident on workers' compensation, for example. It's also evident on other things, implicit and explicit in some cases. In other words, implicitly, if the Indian tribes, for example, don't share their money flow with the state, he might endorse a pending initiative that would take away the Indians' monopoly on slot machines, which would be devastating to their casinos. Implicitly, he might sign on board a tort reform initiative if the legislature doesn't